Okay, so here we are for the introduction to Paul D. Tabor's book, Paul and Jesus, How the Apostle Transformed Christianity. I would definitely encourage you to look it up at Amazon, maybe get a copy. You might hate the book, but this is devastating for the mainstream Christian narrative, and I would challenge anyone who thinks they can refute it to attempt a rebuttal. So I may not be able to read. I got to keep these relatively short, 10 to 20 minutes. I don't really want to go too much over 20. Probably won't then be able to fit the whole introduction into one, may not even be able to fit it into a couple. But I'm going to go ahead and start. Paul never met Jesus. This book is an exploration of the startling implications of those four words. The chronological facts are undisputed. Jesus of Nazareth was crucified during the reign of Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor or prefect of Judea, in April AD 30. As best we can determine, it was not until 7 years after Jesus' death, around AD 37, that Paul reported his initial apparition of quote-unquote Christ, whom he identified with Jesus raised from the dead. When challenged for his credentials, he asks his followers, "Have I not seen Jesus our Lord?" equating his visionary experience with that of those who had known Jesus face to face. 1 Corinthians 9:1. What this means is that Paul's claim to have quote-unquote seen Jesus, as well as the teachings he says he received directly from Jesus, came a significant number of years after Jesus' lifetime and can be categorized as subjective visionary experiences. Galatians 1 verses 12 and 16, Galatians 2:2, and 2 Corinthians 12:1 through 10. These quote-unquote revelations were not a one-time experience of quote-unquote conversion, but a phenomenon that continued over the course of Paul's life, involving verbal exchanges with Jesus, as well as extraordinary revelations of a nature Paul was convinced no other human in history had received. Paul confesses that he does not comprehend the nature of these ecstatic spiritual experiences, whether they were, quote, in the body or out of the body, end quote. But he believed that the voice he heard, the figure he saw, and the messages he received were encounters with the heavenly Christ. 2 Corinthians 12:2 through 3. It was a full decade after Jesus' death that Paul first met Peter in Jerusalem. He calls Peter Cephas, his Aramaic name, and had a brief audience with James, the brother of Jesus and leader of the Jesus movement, Galatians 1:18 through 23. Paul subsequently operated independently of the original apostles, preaching and teaching what he calls his, quote, gospel in Asia Minor for another 10 years before making a return trip to Jerusalem around AD 50. It was only then, 20 years after Jesus' death, that he encountered James and Peter again in Jerusalem and met for the first time the rest of the original apostles of Jesus. Galatians 2:1 through 9. This rather extraordinary chronological gap is a surprise to many. It is one of the key factors in understanding Paul and his message. What this chronology means is that we must imagine a quote-unquote Christianity before Paul, which existed independently of his influence or ideas for over 20 years, as well as a Christianity preached and developed by Paul, which developed independently of Jesus' original apostles and followers and with minimal contact with anyone who had known Jesus. Many of the most important clues are hiding in plain sight. This is as true for an historian as it is for a detective, and I have experienced this numerous times in the course of working on this book. I'm skipping a little bit. The differences between these two quote-unquote Christianities are considerable, and we shall explore both in some detail in the following chapters. When Paul is properly placed in this context and within this world, a completely new and fascinating picture emerges. We are able to understand Paul in his own time and comprehend for the first time the passions that drove him. The obvious place to begin is with Paul himself. His early letters are the first Christian documents of any kind in existence, written in the decade of the 50s AD, and they are first-hand accounts. They are our best witnesses to the true state of affairs between Paul and the original apostles chosen by Jesus. For Paul, this separation and independence, both from the earthly Jesus, as he calls him, and the apostles, was a point of pride and authenticity. He boasts that he has not derived the message he preaches, quote, from men or through men, end quote, referring to James and the original apostles Jesus had directly chosen and instructed. Paul claimed that his access to Jesus has come through a revelation of the heavenly Christ, Galatians 1:11 through 12. He insisted that his second trip to Jerusalem around AD 50 was not a summons from the leaders in Jerusalem, as if he were their inferior, as some of his opponents had obviously claimed. He says he went there, quote unquote, by revelation, which is his way of saying Jesus told him to go. He refers to the three leaders of the Jerusalem church, James, Peter, and John, sarcastically as the quote, so-called pillars of the church, end quote, and, quote, those of repute, end quote. But adds, quote, what they are means nothing to me, end quote. Galatians 2, verses 6 and 9. Although he calls himself the least and the last, he is keen to make the point that his own revelations directly from the heavenly Christ are more significant than anything Jesus taught in his earthly life, and thus supersedes the experience of the other apostles. 1 Corinthians 15:9 through 11, 2 Corinthians 5:16, and 11:5. The force of this point has profound implications for our investigation of Paul and the gospel message he preached. He also boasts that he has, quote, worked harder than any of them, end quote, referring to the other apostles who had known Jesus face to face, 1 Corinthians 15:10. He refers to the period when people knew Jesus as, quote, Jesus according to the flesh, end quote, and contrasts it with his own spiritual experiences, including the message he received from the heavenly Christ, which he asserts is far superior, 2 Corinthians 5:16 and Philippians 3:3. Most readers of the New Testament have the impression that references to the gospel, quote unquote, are generally and evenly distributed throughout the various books. After all, Christians came to understand, quote unquote, the gospel as the singular message of Christianity, the good news of salvation brought by Christ. In fact, there are 72 occurrences of the term the gospel, to evangelion, in the entire New Testament. But they are not proportionately distributed. The letters of Paul account for 60 of the total, and Mark, who was heavily influenced by Paul, contains 8. Paul refers to his message as, quote, my gospel, and it is clear that his usage is proprietary and exclusive. Romans 2:16, Romans 16:25, Galatians 1:11 through 12. Rather than a generic term meaning good news, Paul uses the term in the sense of my announcement, a reference to a very specific message that he alone possessed. The implications of this point are quite revolutionary. It means that the entire history of early Christianity, as commonly understood, has to be reconsidered. The standard Sunday school or catechetical view of Christian origins goes something like the following. Jesus came to preach a new covenant gospel that superseded the Jewish understanding of God and his plan for the salvation of humankind. Jesus passed on the fundamentals of this new message to his chosen 12 apostles, who came to understand its full implications only after his death. Paul, who at first bitterly opposed the newly formed Christian church, arresting Christians to be delivered up for execution, became the, quote, 13th apostle, last but not least chosen directly by Jesus Christ, who had ascended to heaven. Paul's mission was to preach the gospel message of salvation to the non-Jewish or Gentile world, while Peter, leader of the 12 apostles, led the mission to the Jews. Both Jew and Gentile were united in the one Christian church with one single unified gospel message. According to this mythology, despite a few initial issues that had to be worked out, Peter and Paul worked in supportive harmony. They were together in life and in death, and they laid the foundations for a universal Christian faith that has continued through the centuries. Historians of early Christianity question such a harmonizing view, linking Jesus, his first apostles, and Paul. It serves theological dogma more than historical truth. To defend such a portrait requires one to ignore, downplay, or deny altogether the sharp tensions and the radically irreconcilable differences reflected within our New Testament documents, particularly in Paul's own letters. Christian's origins as an academic field of study has been largely concerned with three issues: a quest for the historical Jesus, comparing him as he most likely was with what his first followers might have made of him in the interest of their own emerging Christian faith, and finally exploring the question of whether and to what degree Paul, who was a relative latecomer to the movement, operates in continuity or discontinuity with either the intentions of Jesus or those of his original apostles. There is also the related issue of whether Paul's gospel represents the establishment of a new religion, wholly separate and apart from Judaism. I'm looking to see if I can skip a little bit of this. I'll keep going. It is generally agreed that Jesus, who lived and died as a Jew, as well as his earliest followers, nearly all of whom were Jewish, continued to consider themselves as Jews, even with their conviction that Jesus was the promised Messiah. To identify someone as the Messiah was not uncommon in first century Jewish Roman Palestine. Josephus, the Jewish historian of that period, names half a dozen others before and after Jesus who made such a claim and gathered followers behind them. Like Jesus, they all, without exception, were executed by the Jewish or Roman authorities. What about Paul? Did he merely adapt his Jewish faith to his new faith in Christ, or did he leave Judaism behind for what he saw as an entirely new revelation, given to him alone, that made the Torah of Moses obsolete? Scholars are sharply divided on these complex questions, blah, blah, blah. Then he says, not only do I believe Paul should be seen as the quote-unquote founder of the Christianity that we know today, rather than Jesus and his original apostles, but I argue he made a decisive, bitter break with those first apostles, promoting and preaching views they found to be utterly reprehensible. And conversely, I think the evidence shows that James, the brother of Jesus and leader of the Jerusalem church, as well as Peter and the other apostles, held to a Jewish version of the Christian faith that faded away and was forgotten due to the total triumph of Paul's version of Christianity. Paul's own letters contain bitterly sarcastic language directed even against the Jerusalem apostles. He puts forth a starkly different understanding of the message of Jesus, including a complete break from Judaism. This viewpoint changes our understanding of early Christianity, but linking Peter and Paul in Christian tradition, history, and art is one of the bedrock foundations of the Christian church in the past 1900 years. How did this view come to prevail? The answer seems as clear as it is surprising. Paul's triumph is almost wholly a literary victory, reinforced by an emerging theological orthodoxy backed by Roman political power after the time of the Emperor Constantine. This consolidation was not achieved in Paul's lifetime, but it emerged by the dominance of pro-Pauline writings within the New Testament canon that became the standard of Christian orthodoxy. Even the order and arrangement of the New Testament books reflects the dominance of Paul's perspectives. Gradually, alternative visions and voices faded, particularly those belonging to James and the early Jerusalem church. Quote-unquote Judaism became a heresy, an obsolete religion replaced by a new covenant. Heresy became not simply an alternative opinion, but a crime. We find the beginnings of this process in the letters of Paul, and surprisingly, even in the New Testament Gospels, that most people assume have little to do with Paul. Paul's literary victory rested upon three pillars. The Gospel of Mark, our earliest narrative of the career and death of Jesus, is heavily Pauline in its theological content. Second, the two-volume work Luke Acts vastly expanded Mark's story to culminate with a final scene of Paul preaching his gospel in Rome. And third, the 6 later letters written in Paul's name, but after Paul's lifetime, offered a more domesticated Paul, which pleased the church and ensured the muting of his more radical message. These 6 letters are Colossians, Ephesians, 2 Thessalonians, 1 and 2 Timothy, and Titus. The master narrative of Paul's literary triumph was the book of Acts. The author purposely hides his name and publishes his work anonymously, giving us our first signal that he wants us to think his work dates to an earlier time. He ends his story with Paul under house arrest in Rome. By not relating the story of Paul's death, which he surely knew, he leaves the impression that his book dates to the time of the Emperor Nero, when Paul was executed. All this is a purposeful ploy. Traditionally, the work was attributed to Luke, a companion of Paul, as well as a purported eyewitness to some of its main events. Paul mentions a certain Luke once in passing in a list of his fellow workers or assistants, Philemon 24. Presumably the same Luke, quote, the beloved physician, is named 2 additional times in later letters attributed to Paul but not written by him. Colossians 4:14, 2 Timothy 4:11. The final editors of the New Testament, in trying to support the tradition that Luke wrote both the gospel that bears his name and the book of Acts, likely added these references. The writer of 2 Timothy says that Luke was with Paul in prison and has Paul ask Timothy to, quote unquote, get Mark, and also bring his, quote, books and especially the parchments, end quote. The author's clear implication is that these purported gospel writers, Mark and Luke, were companions of Paul, eyewitnesses to many of the events in Acts with access to documents they got from Paul. Scholars have usually dated Luke Acts to the 90s AD, but a number of scholars have convincingly argued more recently for a date well into the 2nd century AD. And I'm going to stop there and pick it up again in the next one.